what is listening? Listening is the process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken and or nonverbal messages. Listening is not the same as hearing. Listening is a social cognitive activity that is affected by past experiences and future expectations. When we listen to others, listening is not limited to sound but involves data from all the senses. We must see and feel when we listen to others. Next, what is hearing? Hearing is a physiological process that occurs when sound waves are processed by the central nervous system. Unlike listening, we hear things that don't cause us to think about it too much. Hearing does not take much effort like listening does. We hear what we want to hear, but sometimes we don't even realizing what we're hearing. When we listen to people, we take time to respond. And think about what they're saying, unlike hearing. Hearing does not require us to do this. And the listening process. There is a listening process that we use without even knowing it. Once you get so close to someone and have regular conversations with one another, we participate in a process called the listening process. There are 4 steps to this process, which are: Step 1, attention, the act of selectively focusing on certain communication cues while ignoring others. Step 2, interpretation, the act of assigning meaning to the stimuli that capture our attention. Step 3, evaluation, making decisions about the accuracy and usefulness of the messages we have interpreted. And step 4, responding, which is offering your partner some overt indication of interest and support. We do these 4 steps to show the other person that we are communicating and listening effectively to what they have to say.
All listening is not of the same intensity, so let's examine the 6 types of listening listed on Chapter 5. Discriminatory listening is the most basic form of listening and does not involve the understanding of the meaning of words or phrases, but merely the sounds that are produced. We do not just distinguish between different sounds, but we also develop the ability to recognize the differences in the way that sounds are made. The next step beyond discriminating between different sounds is to make sense of them. When we listen to understand and remember a speaker's message, we are practicing comprehensive listening. We do this when listening to a teacher's lecture or when getting directions. Appreciative listening is listening for pleasure. A good example is listening to music, especially as a way to relax. This may be our favorite listening style because it is one that we enjoy and can be done on your own or with others who have a mutual appreciation for whatever it is you enjoy. We all do this at least once every day when we get into our cars and put on our favorite songs, or when you get home after a long day and just want to relax by watching your favorite TV shows. In evaluative listening, we make judgments about what the other person is saying and evaluate the message for the purpose of accepting or rejecting it. This happens when we are being persuaded into changing our behaviors or even our beliefs. Our listening also involves attempting to understand the feelings and emotions of another person. This type of listening does not involve making judgments or offering advice, but gently encouraging the speaker to explain and elaborate on their feelings and emotions. This is called empathic listening. We usually practice this with friends or family as we listen to provide emotional support. Lastly, we have problem-focused listening. It usually happens when we are stressed, angry, or fearful, and we use it to identify problems in our relationships, whether something affecting the relationship or something making the other person upset at us. This type of listening is essential to our relationship in order to find and fix the problem to maintain a healthy relationship. As there are different types of listening, there are 4 different listening styles that people use to connect with those around us. When you are people-oriented, You show a strong concern for others and their feelings, and see listening as a way of building relationships. You talk about we more than you or they. If you are a people-oriented listener, you adapt at empathic listening and use appeal to emotion in your arguments. People who are content-oriented are interested more in what is said rather than who is saying it or what the speaker is feeling, in order to make their own conclusions. Content-oriented listeners like to get all the facts first to assess credibility and truthfulness. Action-oriented listeners are strictly focused on tasks. They focus first on what actions need to happen and when and who will do them. They are focused on solving problems and are the listeners that keep to the agenda in meetings. These listeners are well organized and may be good at discriminative listening without having empathy. And lastly, people who are time-oriented have their eyes constantly on the clock. They do not like to waste any time and will often tell others how much time they have to meet. Time-oriented listeners only seek short answers that are straight to the point and will be very concerned if a conversation carries over time. Can you identify which listening style are you?
Conflicts and interpersonal relationships. Conflicts are a normal part of interpersonal relationships and can even be healthy. Conflicts can mean interdependence, signal a need for a change in a relationship, and can also allow for problem diagnosis. If we look at what it means for conflict to be interdependent, it means that it signals a connection between the people who are fighting or arguing. Fighting can actually mean that you care, but it needs to be well managed. Now, if we look at how conflict signals a need for a change, we need to understand that conflict can be healthy in a relationship because it gives people the opportunity to grow and adapt together, but collaboration is key. And finally, if we look at how conflict allows for problem diagnosis, really what it comes down to is that denial and suppression can be worse than conflict. It causes problems to build up, and therefore conflict allows for the acknowledgement that there is a problem, and also for it allows space for any possible solutions. So conflict isn't something that we should shy away from. It's something that's a part of our everyday lives. It's just about learning how to manage it better because it's a part of having and participating in interpersonal relationships. Next, we are going to talk about conflict management. Now, there are many different ways that we can go about managing conflict, but we're first going to focus on how conflicts become more difficult to manage when our listening abilities are impaired. And they could be impaired for the following reasons. Emotions run high, right? We are reflexive, or we get really hot, it's called hot emotions. And this can cause us to make snap judgments or quick decisions that we might regret later. Our perceptions are biased in the heat of conflict, and this impairs our ability to look at a situation objectively and clearly, and so it makes it really hard to make clear decisions because of our own biases and perceptions. We face communication obstacles. So people talk about the wrong things, or talk about things in the wrong ways, or refuse to talk altogether, right? To not engage in the communication process. And all of these things can make the conflict situation much worse than it was before. And finally, we have personal differences as an obstacle in conflict management, right? And these are things like your attitude and your emotional intelligence. Okay, next we are going to talk about effective listening and empathy. So, as Drew mentioned earlier, listening is more than just hearing someone. Listening is a skill that is developed over time, and it needs to be exercised. As well as Gabriela explained, there are many different types of listening, and the one that we're going to focus on for this chapter is going to be empathetic listening, because it's closely tied to our improving interpersonal communication in our relationships. So, some of the steps that we can take to improve our effective listening skills, especially with empathy, is to respect others' points of view. Now, this might seem like an obvious one, but going back to biases, sometimes it can be really hard for us to acknowledge that what someone else is saying, although we don't agree with it, that's how they're feeling and they're expressing how they're feeling, and we might need to take into consideration that not just because we believe in something or feel something very strongly means that we're right. So being respectful of other people's points of view, and then also checking our own biases and perceptions when coming into an argument or a conflict situation. Now, another step would be to understand what the other person has said before responding. So again, in the heat of an argument or in the middle of a conflict situation, emotions can be running high, and before responding, sometimes, we tend to skip past really listening to what the other person is saying, and we're just thinking about the next thing to say. As they're forming their argument or as they're explaining how they're feeling, we're already thinking about our response to that. And so before responding, we need to know that what the other person has said, where they're coming from, and really understand what the problem is from their perspective before we jump down their throat and give them our responses. Now, another thing that we can do to increase our effective listening and empathy would be to paraphrase and check your understanding. So someone has told you how they're feeling, they've explained and expressed themselves, and the best thing that you can do would be to paraphrase what they've just told you so that you can check that you've understood what the problem is before proceeding, right? Because sometimes we respond and you'll get back, well, that's not what I said. Well, that's not what I meant. You're not understanding what I'm saying. So checking for that understanding when going into a conflict situation can really make a difference. And finally, explain rationale as well as content meaning when paraphrasing. So what this means is when you're paraphrasing, you also want to check the emotions behind the statements and read between the lines. People won't always tell you how they feel, but you can read between their lines, look at their nonverbals, maybe their tone, maybe the emotions that come across on their face, to gauge the emotions behind whatever the statement is that they made. And that will really help when you're paraphrasing and reiterating back what you think the issue is or what you think the other person's emotions are. And that will also help you be a more effective listener. And so these are some of the tools that we found in the listening chapter. We hope that you are able to take some of these things from our lesson and from this chapter and apply them into your own listening practices within your own interpersonal relationships. Thank you.